makan sushi dulu. Mas Fahmi aja itu kalau sebagai salah satu kami itu kami kerja oh saya bawa ini kami apa ya tadi saya kan apa ya pakai HP ya ikut sini kayak kamu ya LO ya ini udah live stream. Iya silakan. Isinya apa ini? Yang itu isinya apa ini? Nah itu yang untuk kabel dulu. Matiin bisa nggak itu? Coba.
Share screen. Yeah. Do we see that now? Should I keep my camera off? Otherwise, it's just doing.
Ready? Okay, ready. I will stop this music. Begitu. White tadi. White. Okay. Yes. White or yes? White. Oh yes. Look. Disconnect. Jangan disconnect. Udah nggak? Maxim ya. Hah? Boleh? Boleh silakan. TU ya.
Oke, jadi begini lah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming and joining us in this amazing lecture on the Pacific Geopolitics and Geostrategy. Before we go further, let's get to know our speaker for the first session, Dr. Maxim. You can call him Dr. Maxim, and political geographer from the EU. However, his originally came from Britain, especially from London and African and cultural political geography. He obtained his BA at the Durham University for Science at King's College London and followed by the PhD at the University. His research operates at an axis between geography, religion science, and education, in particular, construction and contestation of religious ideas of the schools to see the strengths and the implications of this environment for citizens and beyond. Dr. Samson also acts as chair of the Development or as International Specialty Research Group and Association. AHE. Myself, my integral role as your moderator in sessions, our first topic of productions of geopolitics questions versus the and what we do in time allocations is from 8 a.m. And after that we will have so all of you who have a question, please raise your hand and state your name. You can ask either in Indonesian or in English. I'll have you prior the second session for about 10 minutes. All right, let's give a round of applause for our speaker, Dr. Maxim. Thank you. Very good. Very good. Okay. The slides go up. Okay. Okay, thank you so much for having me. And apologies for my bad Indonesian. Careful for me. But I don't have the time to do this course. Lecture series we're going to be doing on geopolitics strategy. So we're going to be taking a bit of a historical look through how some of this kind of these issues over time. We're going to have a bit of theory, a bit of case study material, some examples. Interview before um,
Uh, Mas Wahyu, please select new and show Zoom via Zoom to file. Make your PC, your laptop. Tidak ada. Kita lihat, saya punya konektor. Nah, Wahyu, password itu apa? Vivo ya? Oh, bukan Vivo. Maksudnya mungkin kita kirim. Tadi malah DLSR, SR. Dan di bawah tata usaha mas dan kemarin coba kemarin yang bawah sih anti kemarin. Oh, pakai kumpes ini aku. Nah, ya udah enggak ngomong. Ah, ya, Ego. Nah, iya, pakai zoomnya Mas Wahyu. Kamu baru berdua tak tutup. Wahyu, zoomnya sekarang udah tak tutup yang nih. proyektornya, kabelnya apa itu? DMI harusnya. Yes, share screen. Mute.
Okay, so hopefully everyone here has the slides and everyone who has asked. Um, we might be talking about geopolitics and geostrategy, which implies a certain amount of division across the world, but I think universally, everywhere, wherever you are, probably face some kind of head issues. So we can feel part of the universal planet with those sort of. But thank you all set up. Thank you very much for so yes, as you heard, my name is Dr. Max in or Max Samson, you just call me Max. And I work in the US at Georgetown University in Chicago, and I have various interests, which are largely, as you've heard, about religion, education, political and urban elements within that as well. But I'm also particularly interested in how we kind of imagine the world, how we see places, how our assumptions, stereotypes are kind of reproduced over time. And what I want to talk about in part today is, first of all, what we mean by geopolitics and geostrategy, but as part of that, how this has historically informed many people's views about all sorts of places which they may not even have been to. So, at the very basis of it, I just want to quickly distinguish between geopolitics and geostrategy for you. They are related, but they're not the same thing. So if we just had to go down to what I think are the key components of these terms, first of all, geopolitics. I would say at its simplest form is the study of how geography affects or influences politics or international relations. So how geography affects and influences politics and international relations. So what we see here is that states, different states across the world, may seek to cooperate with one another, or they may seek to compete with one another. And this adds a certain amount of complexity to how the entire world functions. So what the key of geopolitics here are questions of power and influence. We see that states are trying to compete with one another in many ways, have greater influence in the world. So if you have to kind of just think about what geopolitics is, I would say, here's a question to kind of keep in mind. How and why do countries try to control specific geographical entities, spaces, and territory? Okay? So how and why do countries seek to do this? And we'll look at this. Now, geostrategy, by contrast, is really a subfield of geopolitics. It's a smaller area of geopolitics, focusing on how geographical factors, as well as nationalism, guide foreign policy. You see, it's more strategic. The name is that includes in the name. It's more about how all of these factors affect and guide what states actually do. It's more action-based as opposed to maybe more perception-based. So a state is unlikely to be able to focus its foreign policy effort everywhere. Quite unrealistic to expect states to be involved everywhere. Countries have greater influence and ability to do this than others, but a state is unlikely to do it everywhere. So when it comes to things like diplomacy and military power, so instead a state will select specific parts of the world that it's particularly important to it, and that is where instead it will focus its foreign policy effort. So at the key here are strategy and ideology. The question to bear in mind in this case, geostrategy, is how and why does a state focus its foreign policy efforts on certain parts of the world? So it's not just about why do countries try and control specific territories. It's more about how one state focus its foreign policy efforts in very specific places. So if I just ask you, I don't know if I can ask any questions at this point, but I was going to just ask some curious. Why should we even care? Like, why does this matter? Why should we care about geopolitics and geostrategy? Why is this important? I'm able to ask if anyone does need a microphone. We'll see if an answer. I can run around. So would anyone like to answer that? Does anyone feel confident, brave, to tell us why should we care about geopolitics and geostrategy? Maybe why are we even here today? If anyone's looking the chat.
Okay.
Well, we have limited time, so I'm not going to take long. If anyone has an answer, please do feel free to contribute. Okay. Well, I'm curious to hear if anyone has the answers later, and maybe in the Q&A later you can suggest something which maybe I forgot. If I had to answer this question personally, here are three things I would say. First of all, it affects how we see the rest of the world, and maybe how we stereotype the rest of the world as well. Realistically, most people won't have the chance to go to every country in the world during their lifetime. Most people won't go to those places. But you can still have an idea about these places. And that means you have to learn about them somewhere. And there is always this risk that you end up stereotyping places. You hear potentially quite simplistic ideas about different parts of the world. At the core here really is we see different countries, for example, trying to divide the world into different units, into different areas which they see as important. And this is in a way a form of stereotyping. It's a way of saying maybe these countries are more like us than those countries. It's a simplifying device. And that means it does shape how we view places, but it is also quite risky. It means that we might end up stereotyping places as well. We'll see that there can be quite a lot of danger involved in this process. Secondly, I think maybe most crucially when we get back, it explains why political leaders do what they do. Understanding geopolitics and geostrategy, it suddenly makes more sense why some countries are involved in foreign policy in certain places and why their actions take place in a certain way. And thirdly, I think this is an important topic because it reveals control over territory. It shows us who is really in charge, who really has influence, as well as it kind of can show us, maybe more indirectly sometimes, what kinds of resources and activities take place. If a country is suddenly involved in one part of the world, it might be because partly they want to extract natural resources from that country. And so it's a way of trying to leverage that power. I want to try one other thing. So hopefully this is why we have time to do it. I just, in a minute, I want to just invite you to add some answers to a online web page that is based on this question. Keep this question in mind. What geographical factors can shape a country's foreign policy? If you had to think about what can actually affect foreign policy, I'm just going to invite you to come up on Zoom, but maybe put it in the chat if it doesn't. Well, I have the web page up. Nice. Okay, actually, I think because we lost time. Am I still sharing it? Zoom is it sharing? Oh, yeah. So just a few factors, then we'll kind of move on to more of the theoretical elements. First of all, what can shape a country's foreign policy? One would be natural terrain. So it might be that different countries try and divide the world up based upon natural division. It might be hard to have a military presence on the other side of a major mountain range. It might be difficult to have a major military on the other side of an ocean. We need to potentially fight a big navy. So seas and mountains, as well as rivers, and plus natural harbours. All of these elements, these natural elements, can affect what a country does with respect to policy. Secondly, I think we can see, kind of related in a way, proximity. Most countries are going to be more involved in other countries near to them. Most countries are more interested in their neighbours than they are in places on the other side of the world. Not always the case, but usually it is. This is where we see factors like borders being important. Countries want to control their borders, and they might impose quite strict measures and policies in order to reduce the entry of different people into their own state. The proximity is important in that respect. Thirdly, I kind of alluded to this before, the presence of natural resources. So we see certainly in the past few decades, countries that have a lot of oil reserves have become quite important geopolitically. We see many of the major powers across the world being very interested in regions that have a lot of oil as well as gas. Likewise, fresh water, minerals, other things that everyone needs, typically need. All of these resources are going to affect a country's foreign policy. Next, we have any human-made as well as natural transportation routes. So if you have an easy way of getting around, again, that can shape what you do. So we can see a natural example in this kind of Southeast Asian region being the Malacca Strait. For a long time, a very important geopolitical area. It's one of the great world trade trading routes. A natural way of getting to the seas. And then later on, we see human-made development, such as the Suez Canal, suddenly really speeds up transportation between Europe and East Africa, Middle East, and from there, South and Southeastern Asia. So the Suez Canal, a really important factor in shaping foreign policy. And then in the Americas, you can say the same thing for the Panama Canal. And that no longer did you have to take your ship all the way around the American continent. Instead, you could just simply cut through a relatively short section of Panama. You also see the size of the country is going to be important. So a lot of the time, big countries, that might be in terms of population as opposed to size, but big countries often do have more power. Partly why a lot of countries try and claim more territory at the time. And finally, I would say historic events and shared experiences. So countries that might be home to separatist movements, groups that want to gain independence or greater autonomy, will often be allies with each other. We have two countries which have a number of groups trying to gain independence. They feel they have something in common, and so when it comes to international relations, they know that they need to back their ally, otherwise they're essentially being hypocritical, and they might see separatist movements in their own country push for greater freedom or independence. And likewise, places which are trying to gain separation or greater autonomy, again, will often ally with one another. So shared experience is also important. So I just showed one map here, and in terms of what do these all have in common, this is quite an unusual map in some ways, I think, because what we see are countries which are landlocked but have a navy, in red. They're kind of unusual. Countries that don't have any access to the sea, but they still have a navy. And then there are a few of them, but in green we have countries that do have a coast but don't have a navy. So it's kind of the reverse of what we often assume, I think. We often think about coastal countries having navies much of the time, landlocked countries, why do they need a navy? They don't even have a sea. But what we see here is really this leveraging of power. A lot of landlocked countries know that they have access to the sea in order to trade, get resources, so they will ally with countries which are on the coast. They are essentially reliant on others, and so they might establish a navy in a nearby country which does have access to the sea. Their neighbour might give them a special territory where they can actually house this navy. So we see this kind of need for alliance, this need to build foreign relations, because otherwise you can't access the sea. So this is, I think, quite an interesting example. Okay, moving on. Okay. So, what we see in part here, and I'm going to introduce one of the first main concepts, is that of a geographical imagination. So, this phrase, geographical imagination, is a very influential phrase, and it's especially associated with Derek Gregory, who's shown here. What this phrase, geographical imagination, means is how we think about notions of space and place, whether consciously or not. This may be subconscious to us. We may not really think about it all that much, in fact, but it still affects how we understand the world. And it's a very power-laden kind of notion, because we see that if you haven't been to a place, you might still have a certain assumption about it. You still imagine it in a particular way. I'm from England. If I don't know how many people have been to England before, but I'm going to guess if I ask you what do you associate with England, I'll probably hear certain stereotypes. I find it's a lot in the United States, living there now. My students in the US, if they haven't been to England, they tend to think English people drink a lot of tea. By the way, I don't really drink tea, so I already break that stereotype. They tend to think it's raining. I guess that's kind of fair. There are certain assumptions. We think that everyone knows the royal family. Met the royal family. There are certain assumptions which people have. So we can see that it's a question of power here. And so specific norms are constantly reproduced over time. And that affects how we perceive, draw, and write about the world. If you haven't been there to a place, you might still assume certain things about it. And that can be based on region as well. And I'm just going to show you some examples of this through history. A couple of examples which I particularly like here. So on the right, we have Tarzan. Very familiar movie to millions of people. In fact, it's one of the most long-standing movie franchises of all time, and I would guess maybe the most prolific, maybe the movie which has had the most versions of it. I want to say there's about 50 different Tarzan movies. Incredible. So about 50 different Tarzan movies. And it's an interesting example of a geographical imagination because at its basis, what is the story really about? In a way, it's about a white man who is able to constantly overcome his wild African surroundings. There's a certain colonial, imperial assumption bound up in Tarzan that white men, especially, are able to withstand and resist any threat that is thrown at them by a seemingly ungovernable natural African. So, white man constantly in control of the African surroundings. There is a certain kind of colonial basis to this kind of story. So I think Tarzan's a good example. Now the example on the right, I know it's a bit small, but it's a really good example too. This is a famous painting which is in French it translates as the Snake Charmer. It was painted by Jean-Léon Giraud, and what's really interesting about it is it combines all sorts of random European stereotypes about Asia. Now Asia is the biggest continent on Earth, by far. And in this painting, we see this French artist has basically combined different aspects, different Asian cultures, as if they are all one. Very homogenizing. We see lots of different parts of Asia, as well as North Africa, all sort of mixed in this painting. So I'm not sure what particularly catches attention, but in the foreground, we have a young man who is naked and has a python wrapped around his body. So a young man with a python and isn't wearing any clothes. So this kind of stereotype that Europeans long had, that people in the Western world wouldn't really dress very well, wouldn't dress properly. And snakes being a kind of important part of that vision as well. We see there is a man kind of just in front of him who is playing a fiddle flute, so a musical instrument from one very specific place. But most interesting of all, perhaps, is the group of people at the back. We have this group of men who are all wearing different military clothes and holding different weapons. So it's this reinforcement of this European stereotype that everywhere outside of Europe is dangerous, especially for parts of the Islamic world in this case. We have people from, apparently it seems, different parts of Africa, from the Middle East, from Central Asia, all kind of combined as if they are all just one group of random, non-European military men. So this mix of clothing, this mix of weapons, along with a young man who's naked with a python and a man playing musical instruments, is all shown as if this is a typical theme from Asia. But of course, this never would have happened. It's just very unrealistic. And the best example of that in this painting is down to the architecture. So there are essentially probably three or four different places which this theme is based upon. I believe the tiling is a mixture, in the background, it's a mixture of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, in Turkey, and part of the harem in the same complex. Now, a harem, of course, is an area which only women would have been able to go to as visitors. So, a female-only space, but yet we have only men in this image. So we have only men in a space which only have been accessible to women. That seems pretty much like a wrongful interpretation of the history of this area, the cultural area. There were also parts which the floor, for example, I think is based on a mosque in Cairo, so we have a bit of Egypt is represented here. You also see there's a carpet, which has a different cultural origin, but is often associated with Persia. And I think part of this building is also based on the kiosk of Baghdad, a bit of Iraq. There are lots of different Asian and North African countries and places, all combined as one in the same image. And this essentially just reflects a European view of the rest of the world. That basically you can just mix up loads of different places, and it makes sense. But to anyone who knows about these places, it makes no sense at all. So it's a very interesting page in that respect. And I chose it in part for this book because it was put on the cover of one of the most influential books when it comes to these matters, which is the book called Orientalism by a Palestinian American writer, researcher Edward Said. So on Said's original book, Orientalism, that painting was the cover. He saw it as a really good example of his theory. So what is Orientalism? It generally refers to the subtle and constant Eurocentric prejudice against the East, which I say in quotation marks, because, as I'll mention in a minute, who even defines what is East? What do we mean by the Western world, the Eastern world? You have to kind of draw a boundary somewhere, and it's a little bit difficult to define in any real scientific way. So Said says European Eurocentric prejudice against the East is based upon the same kinds of consistent, false, homogeneous images. We see that Western viewers, Western media will always represent the East in the same kinds of very reductive, stereotypical way. And he describes this particularly in the case of the Arab Islamic world. As a Palestinian American, this was, of course, one he was very familiar with. So what we see here is that the West will present the East and it imagines it. Remember the phrase geographical imagination? Instead of learning about the place, the West will imagine what it wants to see the East, has a certain assumption about what the East looks like. It doesn't care about how people in those places see themselves, understand the world. It simply takes power, charge, or representing it according to its own assumption. So it's an imaginative kind of geography. The West imagines the East in a certain way. And crucially to do this, it divides the world into two, us versus them. But it divides the world into a binary, or different binaries, which always present the West as superior to the East. So the West, it will present itself as being safe, rational, scientific. It will present the East as dangerous, irrational, vicious, not scientific. This is called ridiculous when you think about the history of science. So much of it came to the Islamic world, for a start, and one from China. So all of these imaginations, all of these facts rather, are ignored, and instead we see this constant bias. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'll keep talking. So really what's this all about? And bearing in mind that the word Orient certainly in places like the US and I'll see this quite offensive in many ways. I'm just using the phrase that's what I use in the book. Well, the Western study of the East, so to speak, used to self-affirm European identity. It's not really based on fact at all, it isn't. It's more a form of discrimination about trying to make the West feel better about itself. And it does that by making the East look inferior. So it's a way of imagining the East as if it's a place. So, here are the binaries, or some of the binaries also. Yeah. Okay, so here we go. So this is how the West presents itself as rational, liberal, scientific, democratic, free, and civilized. And in Western media, for example, this is how it typically presents itself, even though there are, of course, plenty of examples of Western illiberalism and a lack of science and a lack of democracy. Whilst the West will present the East as being the opposite, as irrational, illiberal, unscientific, unfree, and uncivilized. It's very simplistic, and it's really very false in many, many cases. But the result of all of this geographical imagination is that it shapes Western policy, Western foreign policy, and Western attitude about Asia, and especially the Middle East and Islam. This is what Saeed points out. That the Middle East as a place and Islam as a religion are constantly misrepresented in the West by the same kinds of stereotypes and imaginative geography. As he later stated, as far as the United States seems to be concerned, it is only a slight overstatement to say that Muslims and Arabs are essentially seen as either oil suppliers or potential terrorists. See this very, very simplistic, stereotypical, and offensive view of the Middle East and Islam amongst many people in the so-called West. And it reflects the power of Western foreign policy or Western countries and media, in that they can constantly reproduce the same images in this respect. And I think more recently we saw this in a way. I don't know how many people followed the Qatar World Cup last year, but a lot of Western media was incredibly dismissive of it for numerous reasons, but in part we see these quite charged, quite politically charged news articles being published, even in established newspapers. So it's not as if this was just in tabloid newspapers, but even something like the Telegraph in the UK, which is an established, well-respected, conservative-leaning newspaper, had headlines such as this: Qatar terrorists may well have stolen the World Cup. That is quite a sort of eye-catching statement. And there was also a few scandals, for example, like this one at the bottom, about a French weekly which published a cartoon of the Qatar national team, and you can see they're depicted as sort of Islamist militant, all sorts of weapons, same sort of stereotypical facial kind of like faces, kind of features, very exaggerated facial features. So this very kind of stereotypical and offensive Western view of a Middle Eastern state, kind of really reflecting Western power. So that's one example. I think it's just okay. Another kind of well-known example, certainly for me, living in the United States, comes down to the US border with Mexico. So since 9/11, US border practices have been commonly, very consistently, or certainly in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, described as potential terrorist groups. Now, this is kind of based on really minimal evidence, but there are a lot of different stereotypes which surround the US-Mexican border, as if Mexico is a place which is naturally filled with all sorts of people that the US wouldn't want. This comes down to being traffickers as well, so drug traffickers, smugglers, all sorts of groups which are seen as inferior in US society. So we see the US presents Mexico as a poor, dangerous country which is constantly sending people over its border and therefore needs to be stopped. So the border is presented as a sort of disorderly state, and border enforcement is seen as a matter of national security, basically a mixture of terrorism and illegal immigration. So USA presents itself as this kind of great democratic free state which bordered a poor, undemocratic, but dangerous state, Mexico, and so needs to control its border. And then this, of course, really came to a head in the past decade with Donald Trump, who, in the lead up to his successful presidential election in 2016, and then during his presidency over the next 4 years, would very commonly talk about the wall. Just the simple phrase, the wall, became a key part of his political campaign. His need to expand the border barrier to Mexican people out. As he stated, in 2015, I would build a great wall, and no one builds walls better than me, believe me. And I'll build them very inexpensively. I will build a great wall, and I'll have Mexico pay for the wall. So, repeating wall, quite wasn't that phrase in the quote, but really showing this perceived need to build a physical barrier to keep Mexican people out of the US. So we see this, again, stereotyping of Mexico. Now this is despite the fact that according to the US Department of State as of last year, US relations with Mexico are strong and vital, and Mexico remains one of the United States' closest and most valued partners. So according to the US Department of State, what's the big worry here? It sounds like US and Mexican relations are very good, but in this Trump geographical imagination, Mexico is presented somewhere very negatively and somewhere very dangerous. So, moving on to this bigger picture, and this comes back to something I mentioned briefly earlier, is who actually decides where West is and East is? Here's a blank map of the world, and we'll talk in the next class again about the power of maps, but who actually decides? if I were to ask anyone here, if I were to ask everyone here to draw a line on this map, I'm not going to get anyone to draw a pen on some screen and putting it up. But if I were to ask you to draw your own line on this map, dividing west and east, I'm going to get you all have it slightly different from one another. I imagine the line will be fairly similar in some places, but I'm going to guess they won't be exactly the same. And this reflects things. It reflects that we learn certain stereotypes, we learn to assume there's a west and an east, but we also have our own vision as well. We have our own knowledge, which will inform where we divide west and east. So all of us will have a slightly different way, I think, of saying this is the west, this is the western world, and this is the eastern world. And yet when you think down to it even further, it's still very problematic. The world is round. There is no west and east really anyway. The world is round. You start, where's west and where's east if the world is round? But it reflects this power of assumption and this power of reproduced knowledge. That we do have a sense of there's a western world and an eastern world. And then, as I say, if the world is round, what if I did this? Still a map of the world, but suddenly it looks a bit different. Suddenly the Pacific region is in the center of the map instead of Europe and Africa. And so, where's west? Well, suddenly the Americas are in the east of the map. But I don't think many people in the United States and Canada see themselves as east. So, again, it reflects, I think, how simplistic much of our understanding of the world is. And to me, that's a lot of what the geographical imagination is all about. It's about realizing that we imagine the world in a certain way, but our imagination of the planet is going to be subject to all sorts of stereotypes and expectations. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit now about some of the history of West, because I think it provides a good basis to understanding modern geopolitics, because we see how much these ideas have been reproduced in history. So I said before, if you drew a line between West versus East, it's the same sort of matter if you had to say between Europe and Asia. More on this in a moment, but when you think about it, it's quite hard to divide between Europe and Asia geographically, because they share the same landmass. Usually a continent is defined as a large contiguous landmass. Europe and Asia are on the same piece of land. They don't even have a tectonic boundary between them. There's no major tectonic line dividing Europe and Asia, but they are constantly presented as if they're different continents. So where is Europe? Where is Asia? Where is East? Where is West? If you wanted to do it on a more regional scale, you could do it in terms of East Asia versus Southeast Asia. Who really defines what's East Asia and what's Southeast Asia? Again, a lot of it comes down to people in charge. So what I did is I looked up what are the current member states of ASEAN. But what are the member states? Well, here are the member states. It looks pretty consistent. We can see Southeast Asian countries are members, but not all of them are. Timor-Leste isn't a member, but you probably consider Timor-Leste as a Southeast Asian nation. Papua New Guinea isn't a member, but again, you probably would consider it a Southeast Asian country. And Taiwan, as I'll talk about it in a few parts of time, it has a more political status. But again, it's still in this region, and still would seem like somewhere which could be part of South Asia. Actually, maybe it is East Asia. But again, who really decides where these places are? So, who decides? A few other maps which are important here. At the bottom, I'm going to start on the bottom, I think. We have what's called the boundary line. Now, when I asked if you were to divide the world into West versus East, there might be certain ways in which this line is consistent with the division of West into East. Now, the Brand line is a very interesting, very influential line. It was drawn based on the West German Chancellor, or by him, Willy Brandt, back in 1980, based on GDP per capita. So it's based on facts. This line is based on empirical data. It is based on which parts of the world have a high GDP. They go on one side of the line. usually north of it, well, or north of it, but around lots. And you have countries which have a low GDP are south of the line. So it's based on fact. And what you can see is, on the whole, the countries in the north are generally have a higher GDP. Countries in the south. There are a few exceptions. We see that Japan, Australia, New Zealand, these are all countries which, certainly Australia and New Zealand, of course, but Australia and New Zealand are north of the line, but they're very much in the south of the world. Whereas we see that most of the southern nations are countries with a low GDP. Now, this was drawn in 1980, as I said, 1980. That's a long time ago now, over 40 years ago. Quite a lot of countries have developed a lot since then. So I'm thinking of somewhere like Saudi Arabia, for example. Saudi Arabia has a very high GDP, but it's south of the line. But it's still seen as if it, by many in the West, as if it is a sort of kind of inferior developing nation. Now, in terms of social factors, there are some ways in which West is right in that respect. But in terms of economics, Saudi Arabia you can pretty much anywhere. But it appears as if it is somehow still very different from the Western world based on economics. So the red line, very influential, it still affects how many of us understand wealthy versus poor nations, but it is quite outdated. I will say the brown line was never meant as a way of being offensive though. This was based on trying to define which countries need more sort of support. So there is a certain value to it. I think a different example here is what I mentioned at the top. What is the first world, the second world, third world? Now, I'm going to mention this more in another class, but this three-part division of the world comes down to the Cold War. And what's interesting to me is it was based actually in many ways, it's based on a news article, sort of French article one, and it became very influential. And some people will still talk about the first world, or certainly the third world. But the third world is, as I say, a Cold War term. Very, very outdated now. And all it really was. So on this map, we have blue is countries which are seen part of the first world, red are countries that are seen part of the second world, grey are countries that are seen part of the third world. It is a way of simplifying the world based on particular, generally Western assumptions. Okay, coming back to Europe versus Asia, I want to just talk a bit about the history of dividing Europe and Asia into two continents. So, it has changed a lot. Where European place the Asia boundary has evolved a lot over time. If we go back to ancient Greece, a lot of ancient Greek scholars claimed the boundary between Asia and Europe was in the Caucasus Mountains, so basically where the Republic of Georgia is today. They thought this is the boundary. So people like Anaximander, Hecataeus, Herodotus all claim the boundary is in the Caucasus, because they believe that Europe and Asia are separated by water, and that's reasonable just because, as I say, usually continents are divided as land masses with a big waterway between them. They believe there was a big waterway in the Caucasus. They were wrong, but they had a certain logic as a response. Now, Ptolemy later changed this view to what is now called the Don River, which is basically around sort of southwest Russia. So he claimed that the Don River was the boundary. Just before I move on, I've got a couple of maps by some of these Greek scholars where these boundaries are. So at the top we have a reconstruction of Anaximander's map. It's a bit small, but essentially where this sort of like waterway area that connects together in the centre, that's where he put the boundary between Europe and Asia. Geography wasn't quite right, but he had a certain logic to it. At the bottom we have Hecataeus' map, a bit more detailed, but again, placing the boundary somewhere around the centre of this map. But Ptolemy changed the perspective of it, said it was the Don River. And this idea remains in the centuries. For centuries, people followed Ptolemy by saying the boundaries of the Don River, and they kind of extended it to the Sea of Azov, Kerch Strait, Black Sea, and the Bosphorus, with what is now Istanbul, capital of Constantinople, being boundary city. So this boundary between Europe and Asia has changed a lot. This is Ptolemy's map, by the way. Quite hard to see on it, it's quite detailed. He essentially said that somewhere kind of around the centre of this map was the European-Asian boundary, even though, as I said, there isn't really any division between the two. Now, these days, most people will say it's the Ural Mountains. So the Ural Mountains are sort of spine-like mountain range which run through Russia and parts of Kazakhstan, north to south. They look like a spine. They look quite good as a boundary. It's a natural boundary. Now, there are some problems though with the Ural Mountains as a continental boundary. But first, they're not actually very big. They're not very impressive for mountain range standards. It's not as if they're the Himalayas. The tallest mountain in the Ural Mountains is Narodnaya, which is not even the top 1,300 biggest mountains in the world. There are over 1,300 mountains in the world bigger than the biggest mountain in the Ural Mountains. So they're not very big. But this idea that the mountain range was a boundary was popularized from 1730 when a Swedish European army officer in geography, Philip Johann von Strahlenberg, argued that the Don River mentioned by Ptolemy was too small and wasn't a suitable boundary. And having travelled around Russia doing research, he argued that the Ural Mountains would be a better example. On this map, we're basically on different colours. I know it's a bit faint, but the different colours show different places where different scientists and geographers have placed the European-Asian boundary. You'll see it's kind of largely moved further east over time. Strahlenberg's boundary was the most influential. He said that the Urals would be a good example. Why did he say that? Well, he said, first of all, there are different mineral resources on either side. So if you look on the west side, you see different minerals than on the east. This mountain range, later, by the way, became really important to the communist era. Stalin, for example, developed a lot of major cities around it who recognized their mineral wealth. That doesn't really mean they're a boundary, though. So Stoltenberg said minerals are different. He also said the vegetation, the trees, and so on are different. But crucially, the reason for him placing a boundary was ideological. It was actually about geopolitics. What he wanted to emphasize by drawing this boundary in the Urals was that Western Russia was becoming like Europe, that Western Russia, under the Tsar, was becoming a modern nation, like the European nations. So he wanted to say, in Western Russia, we have wealth, we have modern society, we have classical music, we have all these great things which are like and actually better than Europe. A lot of Russians historically actually look down on Europe, dividing themselves from it. But he wanted to say that West Russia is this great imperial nation which the Tsar is fully in control of. By contrast, he wanted to present the east side of the Urals as Asia, which he meant as being inferior. He meant that as being wild, ungovernable, this unknown and hostile land, which came to be known as Siberia. So in Russia, a lot of people divide between Russia and Siberia. Russia implies modern nation with political power. Siberia implies cold, wild. A lot of people think of things like gulags from the Cold War era. It's just seen as very inferior. And Stoltenberg had this political intent in mind. He wanted to say that West Russia was like Europe, it should be a member of the European family. East Russia was instead a place which was not Christian, which had different religious minority groups, which was just generally very different. And this idea was really popular. So when it came down to Operation Barbarossa during World War II, if you're not familiar with Operation Barbarossa, in short, this was when Nazi Germany decided to break its treaty with Russia. Germany and Russia had agreed to be allies. Germany then invaded Russia, surprisingly, in 1941. And Hitler, as he was invading, said that he wanted no foreign military forces west of the Urals. What he meant by that was the German army should be the only army in Europe. He wanted to say that in the end, by the end of the war, he wanted Germany to be in control of the entirety of Europe with the only army. And therefore the Ural Mountains would be the boundary protecting the German army from any Asian armies. He reached the Ural Mountains. He realized the mountains are not very big. They're not a very good boundary. People can get over them without too much difficulty in the grand scheme of things. And he later said, it's absurd to try to suppose that between the two of Europe and Asia is marked by a chain of not very high mountains. And a long chain of the Urals is no more than that. One might just as well decree that the frontier is marked by one of the great Russian rivers. No, geographically, Asia penetrates without any sharp break. So basically, he suddenly felt quite threatened. He realized that the mountain range wouldn't be very good as a boundary, and so he decided to change his political tactics, wartime tactics. So I think an interesting example of just showing how the mountain range isn't very big, but people have historically seen it as a boundary between Europe and Asia. And this occurred again a few years later when the French president Charles de Gaulle, in a speech, claimed that Europe runs entre l'Atlantique et l'Ural, which means between the Atlantic and the Urals. He said that Europe goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ural Mountains, again reproducing this idea that the Urals are where Asia starts. Unsurprisingly, the Soviet Union wasn't very impressed by the idea that their country was divided into two. So Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, was so angry, he started a sort of diplomatic dispute, really, with France. And the French had to apologize to him, promised never to say this again. As far as the Soviet leader was concerned, Russia wasn't divided. Russia was just Russia. The USSR was one country. And it kind of really goes to show this power of, I think, Western perspective. That the Western view was that Europe only goes as far as the Ural Mountains, beyond that it's Asia, but to people in these areas, actually, it's kind of a ridiculous notion. So meanwhile, the other good example I would say is the Bosphorus. The Bosphorus is the main waterway going between, which runs through Istanbul, historically Constantinople, in Turkey. So it's a narrow strait. It's only a few miles wide in many places, but it's seen as a way of dividing Europe and so the western side is seen as ancient Turkey, therefore European. The eastern side is seen as Anatolian, and therefore Asian. Many people will still say that this is the boundary between Asia and Europe. But when you think about it, it also doesn't really make much sense. For a start, this part of the world, like Istanbul, was the centre of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire spread way into Europe for much of its history. So there certainly wasn't any boundary between Asia and Europe. The Ottomans reached Southeast Asia at one point, they reached as far as Austria, the Austrian border. So it certainly isn't a great idea of a boundary. But also, if you were to visit Istanbul, there isn't actually that much difference between either side. Potentially, maybe there's a few more conservative neighbourhoods on the eastern side, but really, and there's a few more touristy areas maybe on the western side, but actually, in most factors, they're very similar. The architecture is largely similar. There are wealthy and poor neighbourhoods on either side. There are sides which have large religious communities on either side. It was a great division, but it gets reproduced as if it is a boundary. We see this, for example, with the marathon. The marathon there is called the Intercontinental Marathon, Transcontinental Marathon, but it's seen as being a boundary. The two of the big football clubs, Galatasaray and Fenerbahce, are seen as representatives, one of Europe and one of Asia. But really, again, this is just reflects a certain view of the world, and there is a boundary between them. It's quite hard to actually justify. And we see this even geopolitically, in that Turkey has historically acted as a kind of mediator between Europe and especially the Middle Eastern countries and Russia. Turkey sort of sees itself as a nation which is on the bridge, which is on the border between Asia and Europe, and therefore has a say in both parts of the world. Turkey joined NATO in 1952, which would imply from European in many ways, or Western, but it's not in the European Union, although it has pressured it to join. And it has generally improving relations with countries like Syria and Russia, which most European countries don't have good relations with. So Turkey kind of has its own sort of geopolitical stance, reflecting the fact it's seen as a sort of bridge between the two worlds. We can also see this issue when it comes to phrases like the Middle East. The Middle East is a very common phrase. Many of us will use the phrase Middle East to this day. But it's surprising because the Middle East was actually only coined in the early 20th century. People have only talked about the Middle East for about 100 years. Before that, no one used this phrase. All sorts of different phrases that were used to describe different parts of the area, like the Gulf region, the Levantine region. So the Middle East, where did the phrase Middle East come from? Well, here's where geopolitics and geostrategy come in. The phrase was actually developed by a British Navy captain who was trying to argue that Russians were trying to increase their power in Central Asia. So a British Navy captain wanted to say, we need, as the UK, to put more of our attention on this part of the world, because otherwise Russia is going to advance into it and sort of claim greater power over it. It's geopolitics in action. We see that Britain is dividing itself from Russia and is aware that this part of the world might be somewhere which has a lot of military focus very soon. So the Middle East, a recent term used to describe a sort of a geopolitical vision of this region, which again is actually quite hard to sort of distinguish. For example, somewhere like Qatar, United Arab Emirates, these sorts of areas which are based on different natural resources in many ways, are quite different from places like around sort of Palestine, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, which are not really known for their natural resources. They're actually very different places. Culturally, there's some quite big differences as well. Iran is in the east. Typically, people in Iran don't see themselves as being part of the Middle East at all. They have a Persian history and separate themselves from the largely Arab nations. West. Afghanistan, likewise, actually, ethnic diverse, doesn't see itself as part of this region. But it's a simplified device. Again, we see the Middle East is used, especially in Western media and foreign policy, to define an area of the world which is actually quite undefinable, and actually quite difficult to say what truly is Middle East. So after this Navy captain mentioned this phrase, the UK in particular then kind of set into motion to develop a new department of government. It set up its own Middle East department to supervise it and to respond to Russia's development of railway lines. So it became an area of great geopolitical focus. So coming onto sort of more like a conclusion, really. What we need to do here is really question the status of our knowledge, or knowledge. What actually do we really know and don't know? And is it really accurate? All of these things that we think we know about the world, are they actually true? We have to challenge it. There's an apparent certainty of our own worldview. Actually, many of the things we think we know are really just stereotypes. They're really just based on simplifying the world in a certain way. We also see that they're often built on kinds of partial, judgmental kinds of understandings. They're not really based all that much on any kind of empirical facts. They're just based on sort of partial things that we know a little bit about but don't know that much about. Again, I said before, if I hear people talk about England, certain stereotypes will come up. They have a degree of truth to them. England is rainy and people often do drink a lot of tea, but they're not based on the full story. So it's just partial knowledge here. We're also just seeing really some new issues emerge when it comes to geopolitics and geographical imagination, especially thanks to globalization. Globalization, of course, means that we have greater knowledge about the whole world. We can now travel much more easily. We have greater migration flows. We have greater media reporting from the world. We now know much more. So in a way, we should be more knowledgeable and be less stereotypical. But there are still some important changes when it comes to geopolitics that are worth focusing on, which maybe don't get as much attention. One is where the states are declining in power. So historically, and this is very important to geostrategy, we talk a bit about why do states develop a military presence in some places. Well, there's a reasonable argument to be had now that actually we shouldn't be talking about states. States maybe don't matter as much as supranational organizations. Something like NATO, for example, is often seen as more important in much of Europe because it kind of dominates much of military strategy and policy. Likewise, we see a lot of the economic focus of the world is based on cities. We see that in many ways there's greater consistency between the major global cities of the world than those cities have with much of the rest of the country. Somewhere like New York is very different from much of the rest of the United States in many, many ways. Likewise in England, London is very dominant and has many strong links with other global cities. So in a sense, cities in a way matter at least as much as the states. We see it with other organizations too. Multinational corporations, for example, have a huge amount of power and leverage these days, meaning that states don't always matter as much as the fact they're trying to attract certain corporations to them. Corporations actually have a huge amount of political power in many cases. So there's all sorts of different organizations. You can see it in terms of NGOs as well, international organizations, not limited to simple borders. Another new issue is around technology, where we see things like social media become very controversial. Social media is very democratizing. You can share news and your own views with people all over the world. But at the same time, especially in countries with strict censorship laws, that can be quite threatening. So we see many countries trying to cut down on social media access, maybe banning certain social media platforms. So their geopolitical focus is often implemented through the online domain. If you live in the US, there are certain Chinese social media companies that are banned. In China, there are certain American companies that are banned. So you see that knowledge becomes quite limited, and we see that there's this kind of challenge between different countries, which the conflict of those challenges sort of fought online instead. See this in terms of cyber attacks as well. Of course, cyber attacks aren't limited to geographical borders. You can essentially attack a country not by having an army, but by trying to meddle in their international affairs. It's why we see some countries getting accused, such as Russia, of influencing elections in other nations. And then we see other flows across borders. So I'll mention the war on terror. I think next class or next class afterwards. But we see that this is more of a network. So even though, because rather, people come from different countries, it's actually not really about the state at all. It's about these networks across borders. We see it in terms of international crime networks as well. We see many international gang groups, for example. They have members all over the world. They work internationally without worrying too much about national borders. But we can also see it in a different sense. The emergence of new unions, largely in response to flows of people, such as migrants. So a good example would be the Union for the Mediterranean, which is shown here. I've got the key at the bottom, you can see sort of blue is EU members, orange is non-EU members, green are suspended members, which is basically Syria, and red are reserve states, specifically Lebanon. And the Union for the Mediterranean is about promoting stability and integration in the Mediterranean region, and trying to sort of improve integration between North Africa and Europe. But what we see is that it's based on sorts of different issues raised by globalization, especially the trafficking of people, of drugs, of different kind of, items. And so, because of these greater flows, we see greater international cooperation. As an example of a new organization or new-ish organization created to respond to globalization. So again, this is a kind of geostrategic focus where countries have to work together in order to tackle issues which are inherently international. So what I was going to do is, to make good time, I'll just cut down on things, is I was going to open it up where we did it. So any kind of questions, for example, which we can use as. So, if any student have any questions, please raise your hand. You can go get in Indonesian or okay. Anyone asking several questions? We have 10 minutes sometimes before we go to the coffee break. Before we go. Okay, maybe from here. So speaking about the EU and also saying um in Europe itself there are a lot of level of economy. I think all of them they are can be categorized as a different, especially in the eastern part, and then Czech Republic, Slovak Republic sometimes. They many people out there they still feel that the standard of living, even though they are as the member, not good enough. Right now, the challenge for COVID even even getting worse. So, what is the sense of coordinating only directed to make people easily mobile from one country to another, or mostly based on economic reasons? Yeah, I think it's a really good point to raise and good question to ask, because I think it does really demonstrate some of the challenges I think in trying to imagine a consistent entity. So the EU is, of course, an international organization bringing together countries in Western and Eastern Europe, and even the idea of defining Western and Eastern Europe maybe reflective of the sort of Cold War era where Europe was divided. And as you say, there are big socioeconomic differences, different political differences too, between the two sides. And I would say, kind of in the UK, there's also major factor with Brexit, a lot of reporting and around this kind of fear about new immigrants coming from especially Eastern Europe when it comes to Europe, where there's like a migrant from somewhere like France or Spain, was generally seen as kind of less problematic, which I don't like to say because it did happen. But certainly the really with the expansion of the EU, especially in the past 20 years, eastwards, there's been kind of greater concern in countries, especially like the UK, about kind of emergence of new, generally lower income people moving into the country, as you say, with freedom of movement. The EU enables people to come in from any member state, they can work wherever in the EU if you have an EU passport. And so I'm just going to bring up onto your question. The element is about benefit for the Eastern Europe particularly. Oh yeah, thanks. So I think this is kind of where we see certain divides within Europe, where this idea of trying to spread the wealth of the EU in many ways, trying to use EU policy and funding in order to develop new projects in Eastern Europe. I think there's been a degree of quite a lot of evidence that a lot of Eastern European countries have benefited economically quite a lot from EU membership. So I think for them, it is often very advantageous. We still see many countries which aren't in the EU trying to join. There's countries, I think, Bosnia and Herzegovina, I want to say Montenegro, North Macedonia, famously Ukraine, particularly since the most recent Russian invasion, have all kind of really pushed to join. So I think there's still this kind of idea, which is found up in fact, that it benefits, especially poor nations, to join the European Union. But we also see some of the challenges involved. I think it comes down to the Eurozone as well, where Greece's financial crisis, for example, there was a lot of anger between Greece and Germany because of their very different views about the causes of the crisis. I think you can still see kind of things divide. I don't think I'm going to mention it in a different class, but I will just say on that note as well, there are quite a lot of differences, I believe, even within some of the countries, especially in Central Europe, on these perspectives, and again, partly reflect Cold War ideology. So in West, what was West, what was East Germany, for example, there are still quite big political views and quite big economic differences much of the time between the two sides. A lot of Germans still kind of describe Western Easternism in Nazi. But still look more towards Russia, whereas many others will kind of look towards the European Union. Alright, thank you. Dari mahasiswa silakan jika ada pertanyaan dalam bahasa Indonesia. Bapak, So my name is Geopolitics. I want to ask, if we see from the economic point of view, why a developed country is always in older area, and why in the hot country it always old. But when I see it, it's not consistent. Like we see Russia. Russia is an older country, right? But why didn't Russia is rich? And also North Korea. North Korea is they are the same race, the same language, the same culture, but why the economy is so different? So that's my question. Yeah, great question. And I like the fact you linked it to climate because I think it reflects in many ways what sounds like a sort of environmental determinist perspective. If you're not familiar, environmental determinism was mainstream scientific theory until World War II, basically saying that colder countries are superior and wealthier, and poorer countries which are generally hotter. But it was kind of bound up in all sorts of racist stereotypes about even hot countries not being able to work as hard as it's hot. There are a lot of problems to it. I think in terms of countries like Russia and North Korea, I think we can see a lot of it just comes down to economic policy and political policy. Both Russia as their sort of descendant of the sort of main descendant of the USSR, North Korea as a very overtly ideologically against nation. I think in those cases, not so much climate at all, they're just economic policy. And in the sense of North Korea, nowadays, they're very isolated. Other countries across the world are part of the global system, although not all countries have benefited as much from being part of the global capitalist system. North Korea, by being completely separate, has very little engagement, very little trading opportunities, very little kind of economic competition and innovation. And I think we see, especially with a sort of autocratic government, which is in charge of everything and doesn't really spread the wealth. It seems it's hard to know with North Korea because I think most of us don't know that much about it. Isolated. But with both Russia and North Korea, we see, I think, the legacy in many ways of sort of communist era. Russia is interesting partly just because it's incredibly unequal now. Economically. There are, I think, more, I want to say billionaires in the world in Russia than any other country, I want to say. There are some incredibly wealthy people in Russia, but the wealth is very much in that top kind of tiny percent of the population, and it hasn't really spread. But I would say in both cases, it's a matter of economic policy. It's a good question, in part, I'm trying to think as well with other cold countries. I would say in truth there aren't probably as many cold countries in the world too, especially considering Russia and Canada are both huge. But hot countries, of course, there's many wealthy ones now, and again, natural resources are very important in this respect. Somewhere like Saudi Arabia, somewhere like Qatar, United Arab Emirates, all very wealthy nations now, and I really benefit, I think, from being able to sell things like oil to other nations. So mixture of economics, natural resources, I suppose, and political policy. That's it. Really good question. Thank you for asking. Thank you. Anyone else?
My name is Vito. I would like to ask one question about the Middle East. Currently, Middle East is one of the most unstable region in the world, and it mostly contains most of world crude oil production. And over past decades, it has a lot of coup, military coup, and militias emerged in the region, causes a lot of war and catastrophe in the region. And also there's a proxy war between the Saudis and Iran, also backed by the even bigger power, Russia and the United States. How is, in your personal opinion, how is this gonna end?
That's a really hard question. I think I don't know if anyone really has much of an idea. As you say, such a common area, so this I think will help me just convey some of the different regional air disputes within the Middle East, as you rightly mentioned. Actually, there's a lot of, I think, different issues depending on what part of it we're talking about. And as you mentioned here, it's partly a natural resources, particularly around the Gulf region. So partly that's kind of proxy wars to say as well. So I'm going to talk more about the first Gulf War, I think, in another class. But you can see sort of since the Cold War, countries like Russia and the United States have been very interested in that sort of like Gulf region, which has, of course, most of the world's oil wealth. Whereas the Western part is quite different. So, thinking now with more religious oriented, I wouldn't want to say it's religious based, but conflicts surrounding religion. Somewhere like Israel and Palestine, for example, isn't really about natural resources at all, a very resource rich area. There's kind of deeper questions, I think, national identity, self-determination, and religion. In terms of how it ends, I think I would probably divide the region into because I think what goes on in somewhere like Israel and Palestine is really quite separate from what goes on between, let's say, Saudi Arabia and Iran, which you mentioned, which in many ways is partly Iran and Saudi Arabia are two of the biggest states in the area. They have quite a lot of power by virtue of their size of population, as well as the fact that they represent different religious viewpoints between Sunni and Shia Islam. I think what happens there, it will be interesting to see because Iran has changed a lot since the Iranian Revolution. My guess in that region is simply that Saudi Arabia is becoming more and more essentially accepted by the United States. I think we're seeing money really just talking in that respect. In Saudi Arabia, I believe it's probably going to host the 2034 World Cup, already hosts a lot of different international footballers, golf players, is developing a number of mega projects. It's kind of seeming more like a Western nation. I think there'll be a sort of division between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and people find based on that Saudi Arabia gets seen as a developed nation, whereas Iran gets seen as a sort of religious, like conservative Orthodox nation, which is becomes quite isolated. That would be my guess in that region. Israel and Palestine, I hate to say, especially so early in the stages, it's still really shocking and polarizing conflict. I don't feel too confident, to be honest, about giving a good answer to that. I think a lot of it is going to, again, just come down to the sorts of geopolitical relations and where we see the United States largely being in favor of most aspects of Israeli policy, most of the Islamic world, especially Arab world, being very anti Israeli policy, in many cases, the existence of the country. I think I hate to kind of give such a poor answer, but I think I will have to sort of in a year's time or better as well Palestine. Saudi Arabia and Iran, I'm going to just guess, I think money will move Saudi Arabia more into the sort of Western sphere, so to speak, and we'll see Iran become more isolated if that can help. Now, I also have another follow-up question. Great question as well.
Ada lagi soal pertanyaan mungkin yang mau
Perkenalkan nama saya Haji Putra. Nanti di BPT kan ada green line dari green itu yang menentukan antara tiga negara di dunia. So who decides the first word, the second word, and the
Who decides the first, second, and third world? Yeah, I probably went over it quickly. It occurred to me, we'll talk about the Cold War in a couple of classes, and I'm going to talk more about it there. But essentially, where did this come from? I will talk about this, I find it really interesting. Wow. So, I'm just going to get it. Okay, so who decides the first, second, and third world? This is a Cold War era phrase. So I find it really uncomfortable to use, because I consider it really out of date now. But essentially, the First World was generally used in originally sort of reporting and later policy to describe the three capitalist countries which had capitalist democracy, basically. The First World is capitalist democracies. The Second World is seen as countries which are not necessarily less wealthy, but have more of an authoritarian, particularly communist government. So the Second World was like USSR, as well as USSR's allies. So, like North Korea, China historically. So kind of communist nations. Well, Third World was incredibly homogenizing. It was basically everywhere else. So it was a mixture of countries which were either the person who coined the phrase, Alfred Sobey, described them as the exploited countries. He basically meant these are the countries which are just dependent and aren't ideologically driven in the same way as the First and Second World. They're countries which the First and Second World almost tell what to do. So they're basically poor nations or nations which are philosophically non-aligned. The countries which choose not to be either strongly democracies or strongly communist. So essentially, Third World is everyone else, not aligned countries and countries. That's historically what it meant. What we can see though is it's interesting because if you look at the map, a lot of it does just, this map even then is quite problematic looking at it closer. So somewhere like Angola in Southern Africa and Mozambique are presented as first world countries on this map, but economically, historically, these are two of the poorest countries in the world. They both had proxy wars in the Cold War, both countries which were split between pro-United States and pro-Soviet Chinese groups. So this map is actually quite limited, and we'll talk more about the problem of that next class, another important issue. Essentially, First World, capitalist democracy, Second World, communist, authoritarian, and Third World, everyone else. As I say, out of date now, so a lot of us don't tend to use the phrase, but a lot of people still do. I think it shows how much people reproduce viewpoints and imaginations of the world. Thank you. Good question. Did that help? Good question.
So we have special additional question from Mr. Jimani.
Oh, this is
How Americans view about
Oh, yeah. Another really good question. I think it really comes down. I would say it's been incredibly polarizing for us in the United States. So I think it depends if we're talking about the US government or whether we're talking about people individually. And even then, I think within the political sphere, there's been big differences. So, I think so far, obviously, the Republican Party generally being very I hate using the phrase like pro-Israel and pro-Palestine actually because I think again it's quite simplistic. A lot of people, for example, recognise the existence of Israel and the importance of the Jewish state, but don't like everything that in Israel. But broadly speaking, the Republican Party I think is most likely to kind of put its support behind Israeli policy. Whereas the Democrat Party has been much more divided. There's certainly been a number of people who are sympathetic towards Israeli cause and its policy, in Gaza, and there's been a lot of people who've been very angry about it. So I'd say, Democrat Party kind of reflects, I'd say, more of the polarization within the United States over this matter. Now, at the university I teach remotely, so I haven't seen it in person. I get a lot of emails these days, and I get it in student essays actually as well. And you can see the student body is voting widely over this as well. There's a lot of students who have been protesting against Israeli policy, for example, in Gaza. But there have also been a number who have protested against Hamas, for example, and have protested in support of Israeli policy in the region. So I'd say the US, I think we've really seen both sides, and we've seen everything in between. I don't think there's been any kind of consistent view. I think that's quite true in a way. Many American attitudes towards things. I think in many ways a very polarized country, and I think that's reflected in attitudes towards the conflict.
And this is the end of the first session. After this, we're gonna have like 10 minutes break before we begin the. So thank you so much. If you want to break up, I'll make conclusion.
Oh yeah, no, I think that was actually everything. Yeah.
So may I add something? So whenever we're talking about the social sciences, in general, there's no because we're talking about theory things, right? So sometimes when you ask a question, there will thousand or even million answers from person to person because we sometimes elaborate many aspects to the the topic itself. So it is like not a really actually, but of course there's something in common, and we have to follow the rule, the principle, the theory that we have, and we can understand the concept of social work. Thank you.
And just to follow on from that, I think a really important point comes back down to this slide about we all have our own unique viewpoint, our own knowledge, our own background, our own identities. I think of that actually with Professor Marley's question just then as well. Just if I can get a deeper answer, I can talk. I think a lot of it comes down to how people identify religiously, for example. I'm aware that Muslim Americans and Jewish Americans have both, many have faced a lot of attacks and violence from people who blame them in some way for what's going on in the entire Palestine, even though they have nothing to do with it. But they're going to have a certain viewpoint about it because they might be implicated within the conflict indirectly because they get associated with it. Likewise, being here, growing up, if you grow up in Indonesia or even Indonesia, your knowledge and viewpoint is going to be probably quite different from mine because of your surrounding environment. How subjective this kind of question is. I think when it comes to this idea about the geographical imagination, we can see that everyone's imagination will be slightly different because a lot of it is based upon our own backgrounds and identities. And that's, I think, part of what's really interesting.
Thank you, guys. This is the end of the session. So siswa dapat izin untuk presensi. Ya, pas pulang aja. Ini pas pulang jangan lupa presensi. Presensinya udah disiapkan, tinggal mendatangkan. Oke, terima kasih diberikan waktu 10 menit untuk diberikan. Monggo.
kalian belum waktu untuk pulang. Esensinya nanti selesai acara dan jadi belum saatnya untuk pulang ya. Esensi nanti setelah sesi kedua dan SDM Geopolitics AKD.